I am not a historian, but neither are you. So, how about we, the people, learn this stuff together? Welcome to US 101. And for today's episode, guys, we're going to be looking at one of the most famous and perhaps one of the greatest speeches ever made in American history. No, I'm not referring to the time that I addressed my third grade class as, "Hello, my name is Mr. Gigglepants." Why did I do that? How much do you really know about Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech? I mean, I think it's safe to say that most Americans can recite at least a little part of it, and usually when you recite it, you try to sound like him. When you said, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Everyone, you try to sound like him, it doesn't come off the same way. The "I Have a Dream" section of Martin Luther King's speech that he made in Washington, D.C. in 1963 is easily the most recognizable and probably the most memorable part of that speech. But you should know that that's not the first time he told people that he had a dream. Yeah, you won't hear about that in your classrooms, but it is true. But before we get to that bit of the story, why don't we just take a closer look at the speech itself and try to understand the reason why King presented it in the first place. Now, what you'll normally hear about Martin Luther King in your classrooms is that he was a civil rights leader, civil rights activist. He was also the head of the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was a leader of the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycotts in the 1950s, and he famously penned a letter from inside a jail cell in 1963, which includes the now famous quote from Martin Luther King Jr., "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And while King was slowly starting to make a name for himself by the 1950s and the 1960s, he still wasn't making these big grand speeches on the national stage like he would in Washington in 1963. At the time, on his come up, he was still making speeches and he was preaching to mostly African Americans inside of churches in the South. And let's also remember that the 1960s for the civil rights movement was a decade in which the movement would reach a peak, okay? I mean, it had started way before the 1960s, but it was starting to gain a lot of notoriety and a lot of ground in the nation at this time. It's during this era, guys, you've got things like Brown v. Board of Education, you've got the Little Rock Nine, you've got Rosa Parks, you've got sit-ins at diners and at lunch counters, all contributing to a paradigm shift in post-World War II America. African Americans are continually making their voices heard through demonstrations and through leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. But one of the biggest acts, if not the biggest act of the civil rights movement, happens in 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was originally conceived way back in 1941 by a civil rights activist named A. Philip Randolph. And the goal of the march was not just to help pass a civil rights bill, but to also promote economic freedom for African Americans. The march was finally and successfully put together by Bayard Rustin, who was a civil rights activist. And his job was basically to get 250,000 people to march 1 mile from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. Now, if you think that's not that big a deal, it's only a 1 mile walk, how big of a deal? You try getting 250,000 people to do the same thing at the exact same time. Hell, try getting 2 people to do the exact same thing at the exact same time. You can't do it. I can't do it. I know you can't do it. Now, besides King appearing as a speaker at the march, there were other prominent civil rights leaders that were also in attendance. You had Congressman John Lewis, who appeared on behalf of SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Mahalia Jackson, an incredibly talented and well-known gospel singer, as well as performers like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez. And then finally, near the end of the march, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. makes his way to the podium to deliver his now famous "I Have a Dream" speech, one of the greatest oratory performances in modern American history. But here's the thing about the "I Have a Dream" speech, guys. It was never meant to be an "I Have a Dream" speech. And for that matter, even though this speech goes down in history as one of the greatest speeches of all time, this also wasn't the first time Martin Luther King did the "I Have a Dream" speech. Now, first off, it turns out that that speech wasn't even written by Martin Luther King until the night before he was supposed to give it. He got into a hotel room in Washington, D.C. with a group of other people, and they sat down and they wrote it together. It wasn't really done until the morning of. And when King made his way to the podium to deliver the speech, he began with his prepared notes, which expertly, by the way, weaved in references everything from the Bible to the Gettysburg Address to the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution of the United States. But about halfway through the speech, Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, yells out to Martin Luther King, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And it's at that point, we don't know whether King heard her or not, but it's at that point King puts aside his notes and just improvises everything he says after that. And the part that he improvises happens to be the "I have a dream" section, the most memorable section of the speech. But how did King seem to effortlessly swerve from his prepared speech, one, by the way, again, that he had stayed up all night writing with a group of people, to an improvised part that he didn't falter at once? Moreover, how did Mahalia Jackson know about the dream that Martin Luther King would go on to discuss? A few years ago, guys, a recording of Martin Luther King delivering a speech at Rocky Mount, North Carolina in 1962 was discovered, and on that tape, Martin Luther King delivers a version of the "I Have a Dream" speech. Here, listen to it for yourself.
I have a dream that one day, right here in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will meet at the table of brotherhood.
Now, historians had known that Martin Luther King had given that speech in 1962 at Rocky Mount, but they never thought that that an actual recording existed. So this is a huge find. And then later, in June of 1963, Martin Luther King is addressing a massive crowd in Detroit, Michigan, and again, he brings up the "I Have a Dream" speech. He starts presenting the parts of the speech that they sound a bit more familiar. They sound more like the DC speech. Here, listen to the Detroit one for an example.
I have a dream this afternoon that my four little children will not come up in the same young days that I came up within, but they will be judged on the basis of the content of their character, not the color of their skin.
In fact, back in 1960, King addressed the NAACP with a speech that was entitled "The Negro and the American Dream." So King's "I Have a Dream" speech, which he delivered flawlessly in 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, actually was a work in progress for a few years before we got to that final draft that we all know so well now.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
But not only did the 250,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial in attendance get to hear that final draft, but so did a national audience, because again, this speech was televised nationally. Everyone in the country got an opportunity to hear Martin Luther King give his speech. And that speech was definitely a high watermark for the civil rights movement, without question. However, don't think for one second that following that speech, that meant that was the end of racism and bigotry in the United States. No, this wasn't like a movie montage where he finishes a speech, the music swells up, white and black people hug each other in the crowd, and everyone goes off holding hands. Unfortunately, this ain't a story. This is real life. Because only 3 weeks after King gives that speech in August of 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama is bombed, and 4 little African American girls are killed in that bombing. Not only that, but that speech, since it put King into the national spotlight, also propelled him to become public enemy number 1, according to J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I mean, look at this headline right here. This is an actual quote. J. Edgar Hoover called King the most notorious liar in the country, saw him as a legitimate threat to the safety and security of the nation, and also considered him to be a communist. And I know these days when we think of Martin Luther King, we think, oh, everybody loved him, everybody was a fan of No, there were a lot of white Americans that were quite upset at the fact that Martin Luther King was alive, giving speeches, making his statements and so on, because they felt threatened by Martin Luther King. They didn't want this African American man making these speeches saying, oh, we can love one another. No, they thought that he was somebody that wanted to push the civil rights movement even further and have African Americans take over the country. They were fearful of him. They called him a terrorist. They called him a liar. You also have to remember, there were also some African Americans that weren't down with Martin Luther King, man. Look at guys like Malcolm X. At the beginning, he didn't like what King was putting out there. So don't think that this speech for one second changed any attitudes overnight about Martin Luther King. If anything, it may have even caused a bit more of a division in a racially charged 1960s America. But the beauty of this speech is that amidst everything that African Americans were facing in the 1960s. Racism, bigotry, hatred, injustice, so on and so forth. King decided to put all that aside and focus on peace, focus on harmony, and focus on brotherhood. Yes, Martin Luther King did want justice and he did want equality for African Americans, and he said so multiple times throughout his life, but at no point did he ever advocate for violence. At no time did he try to use fear as a tool to stir up the minds of Americans. Even though, again, things like racism, hatred, injustice, bigotry, these were things that were plaguing African Americans on a daily basis. But instead of hiding behind veils of hatred, he believed that Americans of all backgrounds should come together for a common cause: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is incredibly easy for politicians or people that are making public statements to pit one group against another, okay? I'm right, they're wrong. I'm here to help you, they're here to hurt you. It's not my fault, it's their fault. I'm the good guy, they're the enemy. It is a much harder task to try to find a place where everyone can come together on equal footing so that they can settle their differences peacefully. But it's so much more rewarding when it's done in that fashion, and that's what Martin Luther King was trying to achieve through his rhetoric. And even though he was assassinated, his words and his legacy will live on. His dream will not die anytime soon. How do you know this? Take a look around. More Americans are becoming more tolerant. They're becoming more open-minded. If anything, the idea of Martin Luther King's dream gets stronger by the day. And that is it for this episode of US 101, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Really do appreciate it. I have been waiting for a while to discuss Martin Luther King, the I Have a Dream speech. It's an incredibly pivotal moment in American history, and I felt that now seems like the right time to discuss it. As always, thank you guys for checking out the videos, for liking them, subscribing to the channel, sharing them, leaving comments in the comment section down below. As always, you can follow US 101 on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. All those links are down below in the description box. And if you guys want to hear the full I Have a Dream speech, click that link down below in the description box. I've linked it there for you. Just listen to the whole thing. It's beautiful. And guys, you are not going to see me for about a couple weeks because I've just started grad school again, and so I'm back in the thick of studying and reading and writing and doing all the homework things that a grad student does. But the month of February, I am aiming to release one video a day every single day for the month, because for the month of February, I want to focus on the constitutional amendments. Every day, a brand new amendment video. That is what I'm hoping to do. Please do not hold it against me if I don't get to every single day. I'm going to do my damnedest to get to it. But again, if homework and stuff pop up, then, you know, such is life. It is what it is. But thank you again for watching. I will see you guys in February. I am all done, and I'm going to leave you with the words of Martin Luther King, because he is way more eloquent than I will ever be, and he would probably send us out on a much better note.
We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.